Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. The ocean keeps no records. Its waves erase all traces. Its depths swallow all evidence. Its currents scatter all memory. And yet somewhere beneath the endless blue, in places where sunlight has never reached, there might lie the ruins of humanity's true birthplace, or so millions have believed. For over a century and a half, seekers, mystics, and even scientists have spoken of a lost continent, a paradise drowned beneath the waves, a mother civilization whose children forgot her name. They call it Lemuria. What drives human beings to populate the empty spaces of maps with imaginary kingdoms? Why do we insist that somewhere, somewhen, there existed a golden age, a perfect place, a homeland we've forgotten but which remembers us? The story of Lemuria isn't really about geology or archaeology or even history. It's about the human heart's conviction that we've lost something precious, something that might explain who we are and why we feel so adrift in the modern world. Tonight, we will trace the remarkable evolution of an idea. We'll begin in the gaslit lecture halls of Victorian London, where a puzzled naturalist stared at the distribution of lemurs across the globe and proposed a radical solution. We'll watch as his scientific hypothesis transformed into something far stranger. A mystical continent populated by psychic giants, a spiritual homeland that exists more in consciousness than geography. We'll climb the slopes of Mount Shasta, where believers claim survivors of Lemuria still dwell in crystal cities. And we'll explore why, even in our age of satellites and seafloor mapping, the dream of Lemuria refuses to sink. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. Feel time's current reversing, pulling you gently into the year 1864, into a London where fog rolls off the Thames, and gentlemen naturalists are about to reshape our understanding of the world. The gaslight flickers in the meeting room of the Linnean Society. The air smells of pipe tobacco and rain-dampened wool. A naturalist named Philip Sclater rises to present a paper that will inadvertently give birth to one of history's most enduring myths, Philip Sclater's lemurs. Philip Lutley Sclater was not a man given to flights of fancy. Born in 1829 into a wealthy Hampshire family, he embodied the Victorian ideal of the gentleman scientist, methodical, rational, devoted to the patient accumulation of facts. By 1864, he had already served as secretary of the Zoological Society of London for several years, and his expertise in ornithology and biogeography was widely respected. When he stood before his colleagues at the Linnean Society that year, he came armed not with speculation but with a puzzle that demanded explanation. The puzzle was this: lemurs, those strange primates with their enormous eyes and grasping hands, existed in Madagascar, an island off the east coast of Africa. This made perfect sense. But lemurs and their fossil remains also appeared in India, thousands of miles away across the Indian Ocean. More puzzling still, similar creatures could be found in the Malay Peninsula and the islands of Southeast Asia. How could these animals, none of them capable of crossing vast expanses of open ocean, have achieved such a distribution? Remember, this was 1864. Charles Darwin had published On the Origin of Species only 5 years earlier, and the scientific community was still grappling with the implications of evolution and common descent. The idea that continents might drift across the face of the earth, like massive ships, wouldn't be seriously proposed for another half-century. In Sclater's time, the arrangement of land and sea was considered as fixed and eternal as the stars. Sclater's solution was elegantly simple. If the animals couldn't have crossed the ocean, then there must not have been an ocean to cross. He proposed that during some earlier epoch, a vast continent or land bridge had connected Madagascar with India and possibly extended further east to Malaysia. This hypothetical landmass would have allowed lemurs and other creatures to spread across its extent. Then, through some geological catastrophe, most of this continent had sunk beneath the waves, leaving only fragments like Madagascar and India as testimony to its former existence. What to call this theoretical lost land? Sclater, ever the proper Victorian scholar, turned to the Latin name for lemur, and so Lemuria entered the scientific vocabulary, a name that would soon escape from the careful confines of biogeography and take on a life entirely its own. The response from Sclater's peers was measured, but interested. The hypothesis solved genuine problems in understanding animal distribution. Similar patterns appeared with other species. How else to explain the presence of similar fossils in India and Madagascar? The scientific journals of the day treated Lemuria as a reasonable working hypothesis, one of many attempts to understand the prehistoric world. But even in these early, purely scientific discussions, something else was stirring. The idea of a lost continent beneath the Indian Ocean captured imaginations in a way that mere land bridges never could. Here was virgin territory for the mind to explore, an entire world erased from history, waiting to be rediscovered, if only in imagination. The seeds of myth were already present in the science, waiting only for the right conditions to bloom. Victorian dreams of lost worlds. To understand how a zoologist's hypothesis became a mystical obsession, you must first picture the mental landscape of the late Victorian era. This was a time when the blank spaces on maps were rapidly disappearing, when telegraph cables were binding the globe into a single network, when steamships were making the vast oceans seem suddenly small. Yet paradoxically, or perhaps consequently, this was also an age obsessed with lost worlds, vanished civilizations, and hidden wisdom. The year 1864, when Sclater proposed Lemuria, fell into one of history's most extraordinary decades of discovery and speculation. Heinrich Schliemann would soon stun the world by excavating Troy, proving that Homer's epic was grounded in historical reality. Austin Henry Layard's excavations in Mesopotamia were revealing the forgotten empires of Assyria and Babylon. The jungles of Central America were yielding Maya cities swallowed by green growth. Every year seemed to bring news of another legendary place, proven real, another myth transformed into history. Picture the reading rooms of London, Paris, and Berlin, where educated people devoured accounts of these discoveries. The morning newspapers might carry reports of a new pyramid discovered in Egypt, a strange inscription decoded in India, or explorers' tales of encountering lost tribes in remote corners of empire. The boundary between the possible and the impossible seemed remarkably fluid. If Troy could be real, why not Atlantis? If the cities of the Bible were being excavated from the sand, what other sacred texts might contain geographical truth? This was also the golden age of evolutionary thinking, but not the careful, mechanistic evolution we associate with modern biology. The Victorian mind often understood evolution as progress, as an ascending ladder from primitive to advanced, from savage to civilized. Many educated people believed that humanity had risen from barbarism relatively recently, and that somewhere, perhaps in Central Asia or some other remote location, evidence of our earliest civilizations awaited discovery. Into this fertile, intellectual soil fell Sclater's modest proposal about lemur distribution. Almost immediately, other thinkers began to elaborate on the concept. If there had been a continent connecting Madagascar to India, how large might it have been? When had it existed? And here's the crucial question that would transform everything. Might it have been inhabited? The occultists and spiritualists of the era seized upon Lemuria with particular enthusiasm. The late 19th century saw an explosion of interest in alternative spirituality. The Theosophical Society, founded in 1875, would prove especially important in Lemuria's transformation. Spiritualism, with its seances and claimed communications with the dead, was fashionable among all social classes. Eastern religions were becoming known in the West through translations of Sanskrit and Buddhist texts. All of these movements shared a conviction that ancient peoples had possessed wisdom that modern humanity had lost. Consider the psychological appeal of a sunken continent in this context. Here was a perfect blank slate upon which to project every fantasy of lost wisdom and golden ages. Unlike Atlantis, which came with Plato's specific description, Lemuria was almost entirely undefined. It could be whatever the imagination required: the cradle of human evolution, the home of spiritual masters, a paradise of psychic powers and crystal technologies. The very fact that it lay beneath the Indian Ocean, unreachable by any expedition, made it perfect for myth-making. No troublesome archaeologist could disprove claims about a land lying under miles of water and silt. The scientific community, meanwhile, continued to treat Lemuria as a legitimate hypothesis well into the 1880s and 90s. Alfred Russel Wallace, co-discoverer with Darwin of natural selection, wrote extensively about Lemuria as a potential solution to biogeographical puzzles. Ernst Haeckel, Germany's most prominent evolutionary biologist, would soon make Lemuria central to his theories about human evolution. The boundary between scientific hypothesis and mystical speculation remained remarkably porous. You stand in the Royal Society. You stand in the meeting room of the Royal Geographical Society on a dim November afternoon in 1864. The rain drums against the tall windows, each pane divided by strips of lead into smaller rectangles that fragment the grey London light. You can smell the coal smoke from the fireplace, mixing with the tobacco smoke that wreathes every head in the room. Your wool coat, still damp from the weather outside, steams slightly in the warmth. Around you sit 40 or 50 gentlemen, all in dark suits, many sporting magnificent whiskers and beards in the fashion of the day. You hear the rustle of papers, the occasional cough, the creak of wooden chairs as listeners shift their weight. Someone near you unwraps a peppermint, and its sharp scent cuts through the fog of smoke. You notice how every man present holds himself with that particular Victorian uprightness, back straight as rulers, as if proper posture were itself a moral virtue. Philip Sclater stands at the podium, a lean man in his mid-30s, with intense eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. You watch him unfold a large map, hand-drawn and carefully coloured. The Indian Ocean spreads across it in pale blue, with Madagascar, India, and the Malay Peninsula marked in brown. But there's something else on this map, something that doesn't appear on any atlas you've seen. A ghostly outline in dotted lines, a phantom continent stretching across the waters. "Gentlemen," Sclater begins, and you notice his voice carries that particular tone of restrained excitement that marks a scientist who believes he's solved a significant puzzle. The distribution of the Lemuridae family presents us with a problem that current geography cannot resolve. He points to Madagascar with a wooden pointer, its tip worn smooth from use. Here we find the greatest diversity of lemur species. Yet here, the pointer swings across to India, we find both living relatives and fossil evidence of similar creatures. You feel the room's attention sharpen. Several gentlemen lean forward in their seats. Someone behind you whispers to his neighbour, and you catch the words land bridge and impossible distance. Sclater continues, his voice gaining confidence as he warms to his subject. You can hear the passion beneath his measured academic tone, the thrill of a man proposing something revolutionary. I propose that in the Eocene epoch, perhaps 50 million years ago, a continuous landmass existed here. His pointer traces the dotted outline on the map. This continent, which I term Lemuria, after its characteristic inhabitants, would have permitted the free movement of fauna between regions now separated by thousands of miles of ocean. You notice how the quality of attention in the room shifts. Some listeners nod thoughtfully, already working through the implications. Others frown, skeptical. One elderly gentleman near the window shakes his head slightly, Perhaps thinking of all the accepted wisdom this hypothesis challenges, you can almost feel the idea taking root in various minds, each man considering it through the lens of his own expertise and prejudices. The gaslight flickers, causing shadows to dance across Sclater's map, and for a moment, the phantom continent seems to ripple and move as if it were rising from the waves. You realize you're witnessing the birth of an idea that will outlive everyone in this room, though none of you can imagine how strangely it will evolve. As questions begin, voices rising in scholarly debate, you sense something else in the room beyond scientific curiosity. There's a hunger here, and yearning for discovery, for there to be more to the world than what's already known. These men have seen their empire map the globe, catalogue its species, name its mountains. But a lost continent, that would mean the story isn't over. That would mean there are still wonders to uncover, the bridge that never was. The concept of land bridges haunted Victorian geology like a persistent ghost. Before anyone understood that continents could move, these hypothetical connections seemed the only way to explain the Earth's puzzling biogeography. Lemuria was not alone in this phantom archipelago of scientific imagination. There was the proposed land bridge across the Atlantic, sometimes called the Atlantean Ridge. There was Beringia between Asia and North America, though that one would later prove to have actually existed during ice ages. Scientists sketched dotted lines across every ocean, trying to solve the riddle of how similar plants and animals appeared on opposite sides of vast waters. Picture these Victorian scientists as detectives working a cold case with half the evidence missing. They could see that the southern hemisphere shared too many biological similarities to be explained by chance. The southern beech tree grew in South America, Australia, and New Zealand. Ancient fern species appeared on continents, separated by thousands of miles of open ocean. Fossils of the same freshwater reptiles turned up in Brazil and South Africa. Without knowledge of plate tectonics, the only solution seemed to be that the ocean hadn't always been there. Lemuria, as Sclater conceived it, was modest compared to what it would become. He imagined perhaps a series of islands, or a narrow ribbon of land, just enough to allow animals to island hop their way from Africa to Asia. But almost immediately, other scientists began to expand the concept. If you were going to propose a lost landmass, why not make it large enough to solve multiple puzzles at once? The Indian Ocean itself seemed to invite such speculation. Unlike the Atlantic, with its relatively simple basin, the Indian Ocean was scattered with islands that might be mountaintops of a drowned land. The Seychelles, the Maldives, Mauritius, each could be interpreted as remnants of something larger. When sailors dropped their sounding lines, they sometimes found surprisingly shallow areas far from any land, underwater plateaus that might once have been above the waves. The ocean kept its secrets, but it left tantalizing clues. As the decades passed after Sclater's proposal, Lemuria grew in scientific literature like coral building upon itself. By the 1870s, some geologists were proposing that it had been a massive continent, perhaps as large as South America. They pushed back its existence deeper in time, some placing it in the Permian period, others in the Jurassic. Each scientist who touched the idea added their own elaboration, their own solution to their particular puzzle. Ernst Haeckel's vision. Ernst Heinrich Philipp August Haeckel was not a man for half measures. Born in Potsdam in 1834, he had become by the 1870s the most influential evolutionary thinker in Germany, perhaps in all of Europe, after Darwin himself. Where Darwin was cautious and empirical, Haeckel was bold and sweeping. Where Darwin hesitated to speculate about human origins, Haeckel charged forward with elaborate theories. And when Haeckel discovered Sclater's Lemuria hypothesis, he saw not just a solution to biogeographical puzzles, but the answer to the ultimate question: where had humanity first evolved? Haeckel's vision of Lemuria, which he called paradise in some of his writings, transformed it from a land bridge into the Garden of Eden of evolutionary science. In his massive work, The History of Creation, published in 1868. Haeckel painted a picture of Lemuria that would influence both scientific and mystical thinking for generations. You can still feel his excitement leaping from the pages as he describes this hypothetical continent stretching from Madagascar to India, from Africa to Southeast Asia. According to Haeckel, it was here on Lemuria that the crucial transition from ape to human had occurred. He even gave a name to this hypothetical missing link, Pithecanthropus allelus, the speechless ape man. Haeckel imagined these creatures living in the tropical paradise of Lemuria, gradually developing the upright posture, the enlarged brain, and eventually the capacity for speech that would make them human. When later explorers actually found fossils of early hominids in Java, naming them Pithecanthropus erectus, it seemed to validate Haeckel's vision, though we now know human evolution was far more complex and Africa-centered than he imagined. The Germany of Haeckel's time was experiencing its own explosion of interest in origins and essences. This was the era of Wagner's operas with their mythological depths, of Schopenhauer's philosophy with its Eastern influences, of a general turn toward the mystical and primordial. Haeckel himself, though a scientist, wrote with an almost mystical reverence about nature and evolution. His famous drawings of radiolarians and embryos had an ethereal, almost spiritual quality that made science seem like a form of revelation. Haeckel's Lemuria was tropical and lush, a garden where the tree of human evolution first bore fruit. He described vast forests where our ancestors swung through the branches, warm seas where life first emerged from the water, a perfect climate that required no clothing or shelter. This wasn't just biogeography anymore. It was a scientific creation myth, a naturalist's genesis. The appeal was irresistible to an age trying to reconcile religious feeling with evolutionary theory. But Haeckel went further still. He proposed that after humanity evolved on Lemuria, different racial groups had migrated to different parts of the world, developing their distinct characteristics. From Lemuria, he claimed, one branch went to Africa, another to Asia, another to Europe. This would later be seized upon by racial theorists and twisted into justifications for hierarchy and oppression, though Haeckel himself was more interested in unity than division, seeing all humans as branches of the same Lemurian tree. The scientific community received Haeckel's elaborations with mixed reactions. Darwin himself was skeptical, preferring Africa as humanity's birthplace based on our similarity to African apes. But many others found Haeckel's vision compelling. It solved multiple problems at once: the distribution of early human fossils, the spread of human populations, the similarities between Asian and African fauna. Most importantly, for what would come next, it placed human origins in a location that was conveniently impossible to investigate, lying as it did beneath miles of ocean. Helena Blavatsky enters. The year was 1877, and something extraordinary was about to happen to Lemuria. In New York City, a Russian woman with magnetic eyes and fingers, stained yellow from hand-rolled cigarettes, was putting the finishing touches on a book that would transform the naturalist's hypothesis into something altogether more wondrous and strange. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical Society, was about to give Lemuria a history, a civilization, and a cosmic purpose that Philip Sclater could never have imagined. Madame Blavatsky, as she preferred to be called, was unlike any spiritual teacher the Western world had encountered. Born into Russian aristocracy in 1831, she had spent decades traveling through Tibet, India, and Egypt, or so she claimed. She spoke of hidden masters in the Himalayas, of ancient libraries beneath the sand, of wisdom preserved from civilizations that predated any known history. Whether you believed her claims or considered her a magnificent charlatan, there was no denying her impact on the spiritual landscape of the late 19th century. When Blavatsky discovered the scientific hypothesis of Lemuria, she saw an opportunity to ground her cosmic visions in something that had the imprimatur of science. If geologists and naturalists were already accepting that continents could sink beneath the waves, why shouldn't those continents have carried advanced civilizations with them? If Ernst Haeckel was placing human evolution on Lemuria, why not push the story back further to earlier cycles of human development that orthodox science hadn't yet discovered? The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, was Blavatsky's masterwork, 2 enormous volumes that claimed to be based on the Book of Dzyan, an ancient text she said she had seen in a hidden monastery in Tibet. Whether this source ever existed outside Blavatsky's imagination remains one of history's minor mysteries. But what she created from it was undeniably powerful. A vision of cosmic evolution that spanned millions of years and multiple incarnations of humanity. In Blavatsky's system, Lemuria wasn't just a homeland for lemurs, or even early humans. It was the continent of the third root race of humanity, a stage in spiritual evolution as much as physical development. According to her elaborate chronology, we current humans were the 5th root race, with 2 more to come before this cycle of cosmic evolution completed itself. Each root race had its own continent, its own form of consciousness, its own relationship with the divine. Picture Blavatsky in her apartment on West 47th Street, surrounded by Eastern artifacts, clouds of cigarette smoke, and devoted followers hanging on her every word. She would sit in her chair like an empress of the unseen world, her voice rolling out these elaborate visions with absolute conviction. She spoke of Lemuria as if she had walked its streets, as if the Akashic records, that cosmic library of all events past and future, were as open to her as the morning newspaper. The Lemuria that emerged from Blavatsky's pen was vast beyond anything science had proposed. It stretched from the foot of the Himalayas, across what is now India, Ceylon, and Sumatra, embracing Madagascar on one side and extending nearly to Australia on the other. Some versions of her map showed it reaching into the Pacific, connecting with islands that are now the mountaintops of Hawaii. This wasn't just a land bridge anymore. It was a world unto itself. The Secret Doctrine unfolds. To understand the sheer audacity of what Blavatsky created, you must imagine opening The Secret Doctrine for the first time in the 1890s. The volumes are massive, their pages dense with references to Sanskrit texts, Tibetan manuscripts, and Egyptian papyri. Footnotes cascade down the pages like waterfalls of erudition. Diagrams of cosmic cycles spiral across fold-out charts. This isn't just a book. It's an alternate encyclopedia of human history, one that makes orthodox chronology look like a brief footnote to vast cycles of time. According to Blavatsky's timeline, Lemuria existed primarily in the Mesozoic era, the age of dinosaurs, though it persisted into more recent geological periods. This would place the third root race as contemporary with the giant reptiles that science was just beginning to understand. She wrote of how these early Lemurians witnessed the age when pterodactyls darkened the skies and plesiosaurs ruled the waves. Some of her followers would later claim that certain dinosaurs were actually domesticated by the Lemurians, used as beasts of burden or even war machines, an image that would eventually filter into pulp fiction and popular culture. The physical description of these third root race beings challenged every assumption about human evolution. Blavatsky claimed they began as ethereal, almost ghost-like entities, gradually densifying into physical form over millions of years. The early Lemurians, she wrote, were giants, some standing 27 feet tall or even taller. They possessed a third eye in the center of their foreheads, an organ of spiritual sight that would later retreat into the brain to become the pineal gland. This third eye allowed them to perceive the astral and spiritual realms as clearly as we see the physical world. But here's where Blavatsky's vision becomes truly extraordinary. The earliest Lemurians, she claimed, reproduced not through sexual union, but through a kind of spiritual budding or division, like cells splitting. They were hermaphroditic beings who gradually, over countless generations, separated into distinct sexes. This separation of the sexes was presented as both a fall from grace and a necessary step in human evolution, introducing desire and conflict, but also love and creativity. Blavatsky filled her Lemuria with wonders that blended mythology, occultism, and misunderstood science. The Lemurians built their first cities from volcanic rock and lava, she claimed, creating cyclopean structures that would make later human architecture look like children's toys. They developed a technology based not on machinery, but on the direct manipulation of natural forces through psychic power. They could levitate massive stones through concentrated will, communicate telepathically across vast distances, and see into the future through their awakened third eyes. The language of Lemuria, according to Blavatsky, was unlike anything spoken today. The earliest Lemurians communicated through a combination of vowel sounds, colours, and direct thought transfer. As they became more physical, they developed what she called click language, a series of clicking and musical sounds that resembled no modern tongue, though she suggested that the San peoples of Africa might preserve its faint echo. Later still came what she termed monosyllabic speech, where each sound carried multiple layers of meaning depending on tone and context. The secret doctrine also described the religion of Lemuria. If religion is even the right word for it, the Lemurians, being closer to their divine source, didn't worship gods as separate beings but recognized the divine spark within themselves. They built no temples in the early stages of their civilization because the whole earth was their temple. Later, as they became more material, they began to worship the cosmic forces they could no longer directly perceive, particularly the sun, as the visible symbol of the invisible spiritual sun. Blavatsky wrote of great teachers who came to Lemuria from Venus, beings she called the Lords of the Flame, who taught the third root race the arts of civilization. These were not aliens in the modern UFO sense, but spiritual entities who took physical form to guide humanity's evolution. They established the Great White Brotherhood, a hierarchy of adepts who would continue to guide human development through all subsequent ages, withdrawing to hidden locations as humanity forgot its divine origins. The destruction of Lemuria, in Blavatsky's telling, came through fire and earthquake, rather than flood. The continent broke apart over millions of years, she claimed, with different portions sinking at different times. The final cataclysm came about 700,000 years ago, when the last major portion of the continent disappeared beneath the waves. But not all was lost. Some Lemurians escaped to other lands, becoming the seed populations for later civilizations. Others, the most spiritually advanced, withdrew to underground cities or hidden valleys, where they continued to preserve the ancient wisdom. The third root race. The concept of root races was perhaps Blavatsky's most influential and controversial contribution to occult philosophy. In her system, humanity didn't evolve once from ape to human, but went through multiple cycles of incarnation, each with its own purpose in the cosmic plan. The third root race, the Lemurians, occupied a crucial position in this scheme as the point where humanity became truly physical and began its long journey through material existence. Before the Lemurians, according to Blavatsky, came the Hyperboreans of the second root race. Being so ethereal, they left no fossil traces, living in a polar continent of eternal sunlight. Before them were the Polarians of the first root race, who were barely physical at all, more like thoughts beginning to take form. After Lemuria would come Atlantis, home of the fourth root race, and then our current fifth root race civilization, which Blavatsky called the Aryan race, though she used this term in a spiritual rather than ethnic sense. The Lemurians, in this cosmic drama, were humanity's awkward adolescents. They were described as beings caught between the spiritual and material worlds, no longer able to live as pure spirits, but not yet comfortable in physical bodies. Blavatsky painted them with a mixture of grandeur and grotesqueness. They were giants with elongated heads, their third eye glowing like a jewel in their foreheads. Their skin ranged from yellow to red to black to blue, colours that had spiritual significance rather than ethnic meaning. Some had forearms, she claimed. Others possessed scales or down-like hair. The evolution of consciousness in the third root race proceeded through distinct stages. In the beginning, Lemurians possessed what Blavatsky called picture consciousness. They didn't think in words or abstract concepts, but in vivid mental images that were shared telepathically among the group. A Lemurian seeing a predator wouldn't think danger, but would instantly transmit the complete sensory experience to all nearby members of their race. This created a kind of hive consciousness, where individual thought was almost impossible. As the race evolved and the sexes separated, individual consciousness began to emerge. This was presented as both humanity's greatest achievement and its original sin. With individual thought came the possibility of choice, and with choice came the possibility of evil. Blavatsky wrote extensively about how the later Lemurians began to misuse their psychic powers, creating monsters through their uncontrolled thoughts, mating with animals to produce abominations, and generally falling from their earlier state of innocence. The education of young Lemurians, as described in The Secret Doctrine, sounds more like the training of psychics than anything we would recognize as schooling. Children were taught to develop their third eye through meditation on geometric forms and colors. They learned to communicate with nature spirits and to read the Akashic records for themselves. Physical development was achieved through a kind of yoga that involved assuming forms inspired by animals and plants, allowing the still plastic bodies of the young to literally shape themselves according to will. The cities of later Lemuria, when the race had become fully physical, were described as megalithic wonders that put later human achievements to shame. Built from black volcanic stone, these cities were laid out according to astronomical alignments that channeled cosmic energies. The buildings had no windows, as Lemurians could see through solid matter with their third eye. The greatest of these cities was called Shambhala, which Blavatsky claims still existed, hidden from ordinary sight somewhere in the Gobi Desert. A day in ancient Lemuria. You wake before dawn in the city of Gomatha, one of the great population centers of late Lemurian civilization, roughly 300,000 years before the continent's final destruction. Your sleeping chamber is carved from a single block of black basalt, its walls covered with geometric patterns that seem to shift and breathe in your peripheral vision. There are no windows in this massive structure, but you don't need them. As consciousness returns to your physical form, your third eye opens, and you perceive the world in dimensions that have no names in modern language. Through the stone walls, you see the city awakening around you. Thousands of minds flicker into awareness, like candles being lit, each consciousness visible to you as a coloured flame. Your people communicate not through crude sound, but through direct thought transmission, modified by tones that resonate in your chest cavity. You feel rather than hear the morning hymn beginning, a vibration that rises from the earth itself and resonates through every stone in the city. You stand, and your body unfolds to its full height of nearly 12 feet. Your skin has a golden, almost luminous quality, and fine scales catch the phosphorescent light emanating from the ceiling. The third eye in your forehead, now fully open, appears as a vertical slit that glows with soft violet light. Your two normal eyes are large and dark, adapted to see in the dim volcanic twilight that perpetually shrouds your land. Moving to the preparation chamber, you pass your hands over a basin carved from solid crystal. Water appears within it, not flowing from any pipe, but condensing from the air itself through your mental command. The water is warm and carries the scent of volcanic minerals. As you cleanse your body, you also cleanse your aura using visualization techniques passed down through thousands of generations to remove any psychic impurities accumulated during sleep. The morning meal is simple: fruits that grow on the massive fern trees surrounding the city, their flesh glowing faintly with life force that you can perceive with your inner sight. You don't need to pick them yourself. Through concentrated thought, you cause the ripe fruits to detach and float through the air to your dwelling. Eating is as much an energy exchange as a physical act, and you absorb not just nutrients but the vital essence of the plants, thanking their spirits as you do so. Stepping outside, you join the river of giants moving through the city's broad streets. The architecture around you defies modern understanding of physics. Massive stone blocks, each weighing hundreds of tons, float suspended in the air, held in place by the concentrated will of the builder priests who maintain them through constant meditation. Pyramids rise at impossible angles, their faces covered with a metallic substance that captures and amplifies psychic energy. In the city's center, an enormous crystal, 50 feet tall and perfectly clear, rotates slowly in the air, its facets catching and refracting not light but thought itself. Your work for the day involves what you call life-shaping, though no modern term adequately describes it. In the cultivation chambers beneath the city, you and others of your caste use concentrated thought to guide the evolution of plants and animals. By visualizing desired traits and projecting these images into the developing life forms, you can accelerate their evolution, creating new species in a matter of generations rather than millions of years. Today, you're working on developing a flying lizard that can carry messages between cities, its brain specially adapted to hold complex thought forms without distortion. As the day progresses, the eternal twilight deepens slightly, and you feel the tremors that have become increasingly common. The earth groans beneath the city, and sometimes, through your third eye, you can perceive cracks forming in the very fabric of reality around your continent. The priest-seers speak of coming changes, of ice advancing from the poles, of the need to preserve knowledge for future races. Some of your people have already left, sailing in vessels made from imperishable wood toward lands that will one day be called India, Peru, and Egypt. They carry with them crystals encoded with the memories of your race, hoping that someday someone will learn how to read them again. Crystal cities under stars, the night sky above Lemuria bore constellations that no human eyes have seen for millions of years. In the eternal twilight of the continent's volcanic age, these stars shone with unusual brilliance, their light seeming to pulse in rhythm with the crystal spires that dominated every major city. These crystals weren't merely decorative or even technological in the way we understand technology. They were living stones, conscious entities that existed in partnership with the Lemurian race. Picture walking through the streets of a Lemurian metropolis at night. The buildings themselves glowed with soft bioluminescence, their walls incorporating minerals that responded to psychic energy by emitting light. The intensity and color of this glow reflected the emotional and spiritual state of the inhabitants within. A dwelling filled with harmony might glow soft gold or green, while a house where conflict resided would pulse with agitated reds and oranges. The city was, in effect, a living mood ring, its colors shifting like aurora across the architectural landscape. The crystals that rose from these cities served multiple purposes. Some were communication devices, allowing instant telepathic contact across the entire continent. A Lemurian in the eastern cities could place their third eye against one of these communication crystals and immediately share thoughts with someone touching a similar crystal thousands of miles away in the west. The crystals amplified and clarified thought transmission, preventing the distortion that could occur over such vast distances. Other crystals were devoted to what Blavatsky called the reading of the Akashic records. These massive gems, usually pure quartz or amethyst, were carefully grown over centuries in underground chambers, where volcanic heat and pressure could be precisely controlled. When properly attuned, these crystals could capture and display images from any point in time, past or future, though interpreting these visions required years of training. The priestesses who operated these temporal crystals were said to live partially outside of normal time, their consciousness stretched across multiple moments simultaneously, The most sacred crystals were those used for healing and consciousness expansion. These were kept in temples that were themselves carved from single giant crystals, their walls faceted to create complex patterns of light and vibration. When Lemurians entered these crystal temples, their consciousness would automatically begin to resonate with the crystalline structure, raising their vibration to higher levels of awareness. Diseases, which were understood as disruptions in the body's energy pattern, could be cured simply by spending time in these temples, allowing the perfect geometric harmony of the crystal to reorganize the patient's disrupted fields. But perhaps the most remarkable use of crystal technology was in what Blavatsky described as the fire mist ships of Lemuria. These were not vessels in any conventional sense, but platforms of crystallized volcanic glass that could become lighter than air through sonic manipulation. By directing specific tones at these craft, tones produced not by instruments, but by trained voices, using overtoned singing techniques, pilots could cause the molecular structure of the glass to shift, making it repel rather than attract the Earth's gravitational field. These ships would rise into the air, surrounded by a mist of condensed water vapor, hence their name, and could travel vast distances without any visible means of propulsion. The giant hermaphrodites, among the strangest elements of Blavatsky's Lemurian mythology, was her description of how the earliest members of the third root race reproduced. According to the secret doctrine, these beings were hermaphroditic giants who gave birth through a process that seems to blend biology with pure fantasy. They didn't mate in any sense we would recognize. Instead, they underwent a kind of spiritual mitosis, their auras dividing to create new beings that would slowly densify into physical form. These early Lemurians, standing 30 feet tall or more according to some accounts, were said to be egg-born. But these weren't eggs, as we understand them. Blavatsky described them as energy cocoons that the parent being would exude during certain astronomical alignments. These translucent spheres would be nurtured not with physical warmth, but with concentrated thought and emotion. The parent would spend months or even years projecting specific qualities and knowledge into the developing offspring, literally thinking them into existence. The separation of the sexes, which Blavatsky placed at approximately 18 million years ago, was described as a gradual process taking millions of years. First, some beings began to be born with one set of reproductive characteristics more dominant than the other. Over generations, these tendencies became more pronounced until true sexual differentiation emerged. This was presented as both a fall from an earlier state of perfection and a necessary step in human evolution, introducing the concept of attraction and desire that would drive human development through all subsequent ages. The late Lemurians, after the separation of sexes, were still giants by our standards, though smaller than their ancestors. Men and women of this period were described as being between 12 and 15 feet tall, with bodies that were considerably denser and more physical than those of early Lemuria. They had developed human-like features, though the third eye remained active and their heads were elongated to accommodate larger pineal glands. Some accounts describe them as having a ridge or crest running along the top of their skulls, similar to some dinosaurs, which was thought to help focus psychic energy. These later Lemurians developed what Blavatsky called the sin of the mindless, which she claimed was the origin of many problems that would plague humanity through subsequent ages. Some Lemurians, she wrote, mated with animals, producing monsters and semi-human creatures that became the origins of certain ape species. This was presented not just as a physical act, but as a psychic catastrophe, a fundamental violation of cosmic law that would have consequences echoing through millions of years. William Scott Elliott's maps. In 1896, a British theosophist named William Scott Elliott did something remarkable. He published detailed maps of Lemuria at various stages of its existence. His book, The Story of Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria, included fold-out charts that showed the continent's gradual breakup over millions of years. These weren't presented as speculative reconstructions, but as accurate representations, based on his claimed ability to read the Akashic records. That cosmic library, where all events are supposedly preserved. Scott Elliott's maps showed Lemuria at its greatest extent, covering most of what is now the Indian and Pacific Oceans. It stretched from Madagascar to Malaysia, from Australia nearly to the Americas. His first map, labelled as showing the Earth around 1 million years ago, depicted Lemuria as a vast dragon-shaped continent, with a long tail extending towards South America and wings spreading toward Africa and Australia. According to his chronology, this was already a diminished Lemuria, the continent having been even larger in earlier epochs. The detail in these maps was extraordinary. Scott Elliott marked mountain ranges, river systems, and major cities. He showed how certain portions of the continent broke away at specific times, becoming the islands we know today. Easter Island, he claimed, was one of the last portions of Lemuria to sink, which explained its mysterious statues. They were degraded copies of the titanic monuments that once dotted the mother continent. Hawaii was depicted as the peaks of a Lemurian mountain range. Sri Lanka was shown as a highland region that survived the continent's destruction. What made Scott Elliott's work particularly influential was its apparent precision. He didn't just say Lemuria existed, he provided dates, coordinates, and geological details. He described the climate of different regions, the types of vegetation that grew there, the minerals that could be found in various mountain ranges. He wrote of great lakes in the interior of the continent, of rivers that would have dwarfed the Amazon, of volcanic chains that made the Ring of Fire look modest by comparison. Scott Elliott also elaborated on the racial theories that Blavatsky had introduced. He described 7 sub-races of Lemurians, each developing at different periods and in different regions of the continent. The first sub-race, he claimed, were the boneless monsters Blavatsky had mentioned. The second developed cartilaginous skeletons. The third had true bones, but were still hermaphroditic. Each subsequent sub-race became more human-like, with the 7th sub-race being almost indistinguishable from modern humans, except for their greater height and psychic abilities. His descriptions of Lemurian technology went beyond even Blavatsky's accounts. He wrote of aerial vehicles powered by a force he called vril, a term borrowed from Edward Bulwer-Lytton's novel, The Coming Race. These ships could carry dozens of passengers and cargo across vast distances without any visible means of propulsion. He described weapons that could disintegrate matter at the molecular level, agricultural techniques that used sound vibrations to accelerate plant growth, and architectural methods that could fuse stone at the molecular level, creating joints stronger than the stone itself. The influence of Scott Elliott's maps extended far beyond theosophical circles. They were reprinted in popular magazines, discussed in newspapers, and inspired numerous expeditions to find remnants of the lost continent. Even today, you can find versions of his maps in New Age bookstores and online, still presented by some as accurate depictions of Earth's lost history. The Tamil connection. While European occultists were elaborating their visions of Lemuria, something remarkable was happening in South India. Tamil scholars and nationalists were discovering their own version of the lost continent story, one that would become deeply entwined with cultural identity and political movements. The Tamil legend of Kumari Kandam, a lost landmass south of India, where Tamil civilization supposedly originated, began to merge with the Western concept of Lemuria in fascinating and complex ways. The roots of Kumari Kandam stretch back into Tamil literature far older than any Western speculation about lost continents. The Sangam literature, dating from roughly 300 BC to 300 AD, contains references to lands lost to the sea. The Silappatikaram, one of the 5 great Tamil epics, mentions territories swallowed by the ocean, Medieval commentaries on these ancient texts began to elaborate on these references, describing a vast land stretching far to the south of present-day India, where the Tamil language and culture first flowered. According to Tamil tradition, Kumari Kandam was home to the first and second Sangams, legendary literary academies that predated the historical third Sangam. The first Sangam was said to have lasted 4,400 years and included among its members gods and sages. When the city hosting it was swallowed by the sea, the survivors established the second Sangam, which lasted 3,700 years before it too was lost to the waves. Only then was the third Sangam established in Madurai, where historical Tamil literature as we know it began. When Western concepts of Lemuria reached India in the late 19th century, Tamil scholars saw remarkable parallels with their own traditions. Here was scientific confirmation, or so it seemed, that their legends of lost lands were based on geological fact. The equation of Kumari Kandam with Lemuria became a powerful tool for Tamil nationalism, offering a vision of Tamil culture as one of the world's oldest and most advanced civilizations, predating Sanskrit, predating the Vedas, perhaps predating all other human cultures. The maps of Kumari Kandam that emerged during this period were even more elaborate than Scott Elliott's. They showed the lost continent extending from Madagascar to Australia, with the southern tip reaching nearly to Antarctica. Ancient Tamil kingdoms were marked across this vast territory, along with rivers mentioned in classical literature. The Paruli River, referenced in ancient texts as longer than the Ganges, was shown flowing for thousands of miles through the heart of the continent. Mountain ranges, mentioned in the Sangam poetry, were placed on these maps with confident precision. Tamil writers began to populate Kumari Kandam with wonders that rivaled anything in Western occult literature. They described cities built from coral and pearl, universities where every science known to humanity was taught, ports that sent ships to every corner of the ancient world. The Tamils of Kumari Kandam were credited with inventing writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and essentially every aspect of civilization. When the continent sank, refugees carried this knowledge to other lands, founding the civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley. The political implications of this mythology were profound. During the colonial period, when European racial theories placed Indians lower on the civilizational ladder, the Kumari Kandam Lemuria connection offered a counter-narrative. Tamils weren't recipients of civilization from Indo-European invaders. They were the original civilizers, the mother culture from which all others descended. This mythology became intertwined with the Dravidian movement, which sought to assert the distinctness and antiquity of South Indian culture against the perceived dominance of North Indian, Sanskrit-based traditions. Modern Tamil writings about Kumari Kandam often blend ancient literary references with contemporary New Age concepts. The lost continent is described as a place where technology and spirituality were perfectly balanced, where humans lived in harmony with nature, where the Tamil language itself was a sacred tool for accessing higher consciousness. Some writers claim that Tamil, with its ancient roots and complex grammar, preserves linguistic structures from Kumari Kandam that can activate dormant psychic abilities in those who study it deeply. The resonance between Tamil tradition and Western occultism created a fascinating feedback loop. Western New Age writers began incorporating Tamil elements into their descriptions of Lemuria, while Tamil writers adopted theosophical concepts about root races and cosmic cycles. The result was a rich syncretic mythology that continues to evolve today, with Kumari Kandam, Lemuria, serving as a powerful symbol of lost wisdom and cultural pride. Waves of memory. Sometimes, standing on the shores of the Indian Ocean, you can almost believe the old stories are true. The waves that break against the beaches of Madagascar, India, and Sri Lanka carry something indefinable a rhythm that seems older than the continents themselves. Local fishermen in all these places have stories passed down through generations, tales of cities glimpsed beneath the waves during exceptional calms, of strange lights rising from the deep during certain phases of the moon, of dreams that come to those who sleep on these ancient shores. The ocean itself becomes a character in the Lemurian myth, not just a destroyer but a preserver. According to various traditions, the Indian Ocean holds the complete records of the lost continent in its molecular structure. Every wave contains fragments of information, encoded in the arrangement of water molecules, waiting for humanity to develop the technology or consciousness to read them. Some modern believers practice a form of meditation where they sit in the surf, allowing the waves to wash over them, claiming they can receive downloads of Lemurian knowledge through the water's touch. In Sri Lanka, there are Buddhist traditions that long predate Western ideas of Lemuria but seem to echo them. Ancient texts speak of Lanka as being much larger in the past, extending far to the south before supernatural beings or natural catastrophes reduced it to its current size. The indigenous Veda people have oral traditions of their ancestors coming from a land that sank beneath the waves, forcing them to take refuge in the island's forests. These stories, neither influenced by nor influencing Western occultism, suggest that the idea of lost lands in the Indian Ocean arises from something deeper than mere speculation. The Maldives, those low-lying islands that seem so vulnerable to rising seas, are said by some to be the last mountain peaks of Lemuria still above water. Local folklore speaks of the islands being much larger in the past, of causeways connecting them that can sometimes be seen from boats when the water is exceptionally clear. Fishermen report finding carved stones in their nets, stones that seem too regular to be natural, but are found far from any known archaeological site. Rudolf Steiner's Akashic Records. Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian philosopher who founded anthroposophy after breaking with the Theosophical Society, brought a new level of detail and strangeness to the Lemurian mythology. Unlike Blavatsky, who claimed to have received her information from hidden masters and ancient texts, Steiner claimed direct access to what he called the Akashic Records through his own clairvoyant abilities. His descriptions of Lemuria, delivered in lectures throughout the early 20th century, were precise, elaborate, and utterly fantastic. According to Steiner, the Lemurians lived in a world that would be almost unrecognizable to us. The Earth itself was different, still partially molten, with a thick, steamy atmosphere that was more like a dense fog than air as we know it. The ground was not fully solid, but had a consistency Steiner, compared to boiling porridge, constantly shifting and reforming. In this primordial landscape, the Lemurians didn't walk so much as float or swim through the dense atmosphere, propelling themselves with flipper-like appendages that were as much energy projections as physical limbs. Steiner's Lemurians didn't have memory as we understand it. They couldn't recall personal experiences from their past. Instead, they possessed a kind of inherited memory, a direct connection to the experiences of their ancestors that flowed through their bloodlines like genetic information. A young Lemurian would know how to perform tasks not because they had been taught, but because their ancestors had performed those tasks, and the knowledge was literally in their blood. This created a form of immortality, where individual death meant little because the essential knowledge and experience of the race continued unbroken. The relationship between Lemurians and nature, in Steiner's vision, was one of direct magical connection. They could influence plant growth through their feelings, causing flowers to bloom through joy or trees to wither through anger. They didn't need to build shelters because they could cause the living vegetation to grow into protective formations around them. Their architecture was organic, shaped from living trees and vines that continued to grow and evolve even as they served as dwellings. Steiner described Lemurian education as beginning before birth. The mother would sing specific melodies to the developing child, melodies that weren't entertainment but programming, encoding specific capacities and knowledge into the child's etheric body. After birth, education continued through what Steiner called memory of the blood, where children would be brought into contact with ancient objects or locations that would trigger inherited memories, suddenly giving them access to vast stores of ancestral knowledge. The Lemurian relationship with animals, according to Steiner, was one of mutual psychic connection. Lemurians could experience the world through the senses of animals, seeing through the eyes of birds, feeling through the skin of fish, running with the legs of deer. This wasn't telepathy exactly, but a kind of consciousness merger, where the boundary between human and animal temporarily dissolved. Some animals were specifically evolved as sensory extensions for humans, living tools that expanded human perception into realms otherwise inaccessible. Steiner's most remarkable claim about Lemuria concerned what he called the moon crisis. According to his cosmology, the moon was not always separate from Earth, but was once part of our planet. During the Lemurian epoch, cosmic forces caused the moon to separate and begin orbiting Earth. This cosmic catastrophe fundamentally changed human consciousness. Before the separation, humans were more dreamlike and clairvoyant. After it, they began to develop individual consciousness and logical thinking, but at the cost of losing their natural spiritual perception. The technology of Steiner's Lemuria was based on what he called life force, rather than mechanical principles. Lemurians could construct devices from special plant materials that would continue to grow and adapt even after being harvested. These living machines could perform work by channeling the vital forces of nature rather than consuming fuel. A Lemurian mill, for example, wouldn't use water or wind power, but would operate through the concentrated life force of specially cultivated seed pods that released energy as they sprouted. The channelers speak. By the middle of the 20th century, a new wave of information about Lemuria began flowing through an unexpected source: channelers and psychic mediums who claimed to be in direct contact with Lemurian consciousness. These modern revelations added layers of detail to the mythology that even Blavatsky might have found surprising. The channeled messages presented Lemuria not as a completely lost civilization, but as one that had transcended physical existence and now existed in higher dimensions, ready to share its wisdom with humanity. One of the most influential channelers was Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet who gave thousands of psychic readings while in trance states. Cayce's Lemuria was a peaceful, spiritually advanced civilization that existed before Atlantis, in the Pacific rather than the Indian Ocean. According to his readings, the Lemurians were the first humans to achieve true spiritual consciousness, developing technologies based on crystal power and mental energy that made our modern machines look primitive by comparison. They could heal any disease through sound and color therapy, communicate instantly across any distance through crystalline devices, and travel not just around the world but to other dimensions of reality. In the 1970s and 80s, a proliferation of channelers claimed contact with Lemurian entities. These beings, they said, hadn't died when their continents sank, but had evolved into a higher vibrational state, becoming beings of pure consciousness who could still communicate with receptive humans. The messages they conveyed spoke of an imminent transformation of human consciousness, a return to the Lemurian understanding of reality, where the separation between spirit and matter would dissolve. J.Z. Knight, who claims to channel a entity called Ramtha, described Lemuria as lasting from roughly 500,000 to 50,000 years ago. In her channelings, Lemuria was presented as a thought-responsive reality where consciousness could directly manipulate matter. The Lemurians lived for thousands of years, not through medical technology, but through their understanding that aging was simply a belief system that could be transcended. They could teleport through focused intention, manifest objects from pure thought, and experience multiple dimensions simultaneously. The channeled descriptions of Lemurian society emphasized its non-hierarchical nature. There were no governments as we understand them, no laws, no formal economy. Instead, Lemurians operated through a kind of telepathic consensus, where the needs and desires of all were instantly known and naturally harmonized. Resources were shared freely because the concept of scarcity didn't exist in a reality where thought could manifest anything needed. Conflict was impossible when everyone could feel everyone else's emotions as their own. Mount Shasta's hidden city, rising 14,000 feet from the northern California landscape, Mount Shasta stands alone, a massive volcanic pyramid wrapped in glaciers and frequently crowned with lenticular clouds that look like flying saucers frozen in the sky. This mountain has become the most important pilgrimage site for modern believers. In Lemuria, a place where the lost continent supposedly lives on, not beneath the ocean, but inside the mountain itself, in a city called Telos that exists in a higher dimensional frequency, invisible to ordinary sight. The connection between Mount Shasta and Lemuria began in 1883 with Frederick Spencer Oliver, a teenager from the nearby town of Eureka, who claimed to have written a book called A Dweller on Two Planets through automatic writing. Oliver said the book was dictated to him by Philos the Thebetan, a disembodied master who had lived multiple lives in both Lemuria and Atlantis. In Oliver's narrative, Mount Shasta contained secret chambers and tunnels used by survivors of the sunken continents who had achieved immortality through spiritual development. But it was in the 1930s that Mount Shasta truly became synonymous with Lemuria in American occult culture. Stories began circulating of strange sightings on the mountain, tall, robed figures with unusual features who would appear to hikers and then vanish impossibly quickly, mysterious lights that danced around the summit at night, sounds of bells and chanting coming from inside the mountain when no one was there. Local newspapers reported these stories with a mixture of skepticism and fascination, and soon spiritual seekers from around the country were making pilgrimages to the mountain. The most detailed descriptions of Mount Shasta's Lemurian colony came from those who claimed to have been invited inside. They spoke of entering through hidden doorways that appeared solid rock to uninitiated eyes, but would shimmer and become permeable for those with the proper vibrational frequency. Inside, they described a vast city illuminated by a sourceless light that seemed to emanate from the air itself. The architecture was said to be crystalline, with buildings that grew from the cavern floor like enormous gems, their faceted walls pulsing with soft colours that responded to the thoughts and emotions of those nearby. According to these accounts, the Lemurians of Mount Shasta, sometimes called Telosians, stood 7 to 8 feet tall with elongated skulls and large, luminous eyes. Their hair was described as white or golden, flowing to their waists, and their skin had a translucent quality that seemed to glow from within. They wore robes woven from a fabric unknown on the surface world, material that seemed to be made of light itself, changing colour and opacity according to the wearer's needs. The society within Telos was described as a perfect fusion of advanced technology and spiritual development. The Lemurians had supposedly developed machines that operated on thought and intention rather than mechanical principles. Their computers were crystalline matrices that interfaced directly with consciousness, allowing instant access to any information through mental query. Their food was produced through a form of materialization, drawing nutrients directly from the cosmic energy field and forming them into whatever foods were desired. Transportation within the mountain city was said to occur through a network of electromagnetic shuttles that moved through tunnels at incredible speeds, or through teleportation platforms that could instantly transport individuals anywhere within the vast underground complex. Some accounts described seeing chambers where Lemurians lay in suspended animation, their bodies maintained for centuries, while their consciousness travelled to other dimensions or planets. The governing system of Telos was described as a form of enlightened council, where decisions were made not through debate or voting, but through a melding of consciousness, where all perspectives were simultaneously experienced, and the optimal solution naturally emerged. There was no crime, no poverty, no disease, because the vibrational frequency of the city made such lower consciousness phenomena impossible. Anyone harboring negative intentions would find themselves unable to maintain their presence in the city, automatically phase-shifting back to the regular three-dimensional world. The purpose of this hidden city, believers claimed, was to preserve the wisdom and knowledge of Lemuria until humanity was ready to receive it. The Telosians were said to be waiting for the moment when surface humanity would raise its consciousness sufficiently to rejoin their Lemurian brothers and sisters. They monitored the surface world through their crystalline viewing screens, occasionally emerging to help individuals they deemed ready for higher teachings, but generally maintaining their isolation until the prophesied reunion could occur. Local businesses in the Mount Shasta area have embraced the Lemurian legend with entrepreneurial enthusiasm. Crystal shops, spiritual retreat centers, and guided meditation tours proliferate in the small town at the mountain's base. You can buy Lemurian seed crystals claimed to be programmed with ancient wisdom, book a session with someone who channels messages from the Telosians, or join a group meditation aimed at making contact with the inner city. The annual Wesak celebration draws thousands who believe that Buddha and other ascended masters gather etherically on Mount Shasta during the full moon of May. Whether you believe the stories or not, there's something undeniably powerful about Mount Shasta. Perhaps it's the way the mountain creates its own weather, wrapping itself in clouds that appear from nowhere. Perhaps it's the genuine geological mysteries of the area, the extensive network of lava tubes and caves that really do honeycomb parts of the mountain. Or perhaps it's simply that so many people have projected their hopes and dreams onto this peak that it has become a kind of psychic beacon, drawing seekers from around the world to stand on its slopes and wonder what lies beneath. Frederick Oliver's Phylos. Frederick Spencer Oliver was just 17 years old in 1883 when he began experiencing what he described as an overwhelming compulsion to write. Living in the small gold rush town of Eureka, California, in the shadow of Mount Shasta, Oliver had no particular interest in spiritualism or the occult. Yet he found himself seized by a force that moved his hand across paper, writing words that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his own mind. The entity dictating through him identified itself as Phylos the Tibetan, a soul who had lived multiple incarnations, including lives in both Atlantis and Lemuria. For 3 years, this strange collaboration continued. Oliver would enter a trance-like state, his hand moving automatically across the page, filling notebook after notebook with elaborate descriptions of technologies and civilizations that wouldn't enter popular consciousness for decades. He wrote of airships powered by cosmic energy, of devices that could transmit images and sound across vast distances, of weapons that could disintegrate matter at the atomic level. Remember, this was the 1880s. Before radio, before airplanes, before atomic theory was widely understood. The resulting manuscript, A Dweller on Two Planets, wasn't published until 1899, and even then only because Oliver's mother, after her son's death at age 33, felt compelled to share what she believed was a genuine revelation from beyond. The book described Mount Shasta as a repository of ancient records and technologies, protected by a brotherhood of advanced beings who had transcended physical death. These beings, according to Phylos, maintained hidden chambers within the mountain, where they preserved artifacts and knowledge from the sunken continents, waiting for humanity to evolve to a point where it could safely use such power. Oliver's description of Lemurian refugees living inside Mount Shasta included precise details that would become canonical in later accounts. He wrote of seeing them in his visions, tall beings in white robes who could materialize and dematerialize at will, who communicated telepathically, who had conquered aging and disease through their understanding of cosmic laws. He described their underground chambers as lit by a cold light that needed no fuel, their libraries as containing records, impressed directly onto imperishable metal sheets that could be read by mental impression rather than visual scanning. What makes Oliver's story particularly intriguing is his own ambivalence about the experience. He never claimed to be a prophet or spiritual teacher. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the source of the material he had written, sometimes suggesting it came from his own subconscious, other times wondering if he really had been in contact with a disembodied intelligence. His early death from tuberculosis prevented him from seeing how influential his work would become, how it would inspire thousands to seek the hidden city within Mount Shasta that Philos had described. You climb the sacred mountain. You begin your ascent of Mount Shasta at dawn, when the mountain glows rose and gold in the first light. The Bunny Flat trailhead lies at 8,000 feet, and already the air feels different here. Thinner, cleaner, charged with something indefinable. Pine resin and snowmelt create a scent that seems to clear not just your sinuses but your thoughts. Each footstep on the volcanic soil sounds hollow, as if vast spaces lie beneath. As you climb, following the well-worn trail that winds up through sparse forests of pine and fir, you notice how sound behaves strangely here. Your footsteps seem to echo from directions that make no sense, as if the mountain itself is listening and responding. Bird calls carry impossibly far, then cut off abruptly, as if passing through invisible barriers. The wind through the trees sometimes sounds like distant voices, just at the edge of comprehension, speaking in languages you almost but don't quite understand. At 10,000 feet, you break above the tree line. The landscape becomes alien, all red and black volcanic rock, patches of snow even in summer, and that endless sky that seems closer here than anywhere else you've been. You stop to rest on a boulder, and as you catch your breath, you notice something odd. The rocks around you seem to shimmer occasionally, as if heat waves are rising from them, but the air is cold at this altitude. When you look directly at these shimmers, they vanish, but in your peripheral vision, they seem to form patterns, doorways, suggestions of structures that shouldn't be there. You're not alone on the mountain. Other climbers pass you, some clearly here for the physical challenge, others obviously pilgrims like yourself. You recognize them by their eyes, the way they pause at certain spots and seem to be listening to something only they can hear. One woman stops near you, closes her eyes, and holds a crystal to her forehead. An older man sits in lotus position on a flat rock, apparently meditating but occasionally smiling, as if in conversation with an invisible companion. As you climb higher, approaching 12,000 feet, the ordinary world seems very far away. Your phone has long since lost signal. The concerns that seemed so important yesterday feel like memories from another lifetime. The mountain has its own reality, its own rules. You find yourself thinking thoughts that don't feel entirely your own. Images flash through your mind. Vast chambers lit by glowing crystals, beings of light moving through spaces that exist outside normal geometry, libraries where books are living things that share their knowledge through touch. Near a formation called Red Banks, you experience something that makes you stop in your tracks. For just a moment, the solid rock face in front of you seems to become transparent. Beyond it, you glimpse, or think you glimpse, a vast hollow space. A cavern that couldn't possibly exist, according to geology, but seems absolutely real in that instant. There are lights moving in that space. Not electric lights, but something more organic, more alive. Then you blink, and there's only solid rock, red volcanic stone that's been here for millennia. The summit still lies above you, but you realize you don't need to reach it. Whatever you came here seeking, you've already found. Or it's found you. The mountain has shown you something, even if you're not sure what. As you begin your descent, you notice that other pilgrims are doing the same, each having reached their own perfect altitude, their own moment of recognition. The mountain gives each person exactly what they're ready to receive, no more, no less. The I am activity. In 1930, a mining engineer named Guy Warren Ballard was hiking on Mount Shasta when he claimed to have an encounter that would transform not just his life, but the lives of hundreds of thousands of followers. According to Ballard's account, published under the pen name Godfrey Ray King, he met a mysterious youth on the mountainside who offered him a creamy liquid that looked like milk but tasted like ambrosia. This youth revealed himself to be the Comte de Saint-Germain, an 18th century European mystic who had achieved immortality and now worked to elevate human consciousness as an ascended master. Saint-Germain, Ballard claimed, took him on a series of out-of-body journeys to hidden retreats inside Mount Shasta and other mountains around the world. In these retreats, Ballard saw the preserved records and technologies of Lemuria, witnessed gatherings of ascended masters planning humanity's spiritual evolution, and received teachings about the I Am presence, the divine spark within every human that could be activated through specific practices and affirmations. The I Am activity, as Ballard's movement came to be called, grew with astonishing speed during the 1930s. Within a few years, hundreds of thousands of people were attending I Am conferences, practicing the decrees and affirmations Ballard taught, and wearing the purple and gold colours that symbolise spiritual transformation. The movement taught that Mount Shasta contained one of the most important retreats of the Great White Brotherhood, where masters from Lemuria and other ancient civilizations maintained the spiritual balance of the planet. According to I Am teachings, the Lemurians inside Mount Shasta weren't simply refugees from a sunken continent, but active participants in humanity's evolution. They maintained what Ballard called the unfed flame, an actual spiritual fire that had been brought from Lemuria before its destruction and now burned eternally in a chamber deep within the mountain. This flame was said to be one of several around the planet that maintained the spiritual life force of Earth, preventing humanity from falling into complete materialism and darkness. The practices of the I Am activity centered on the use of affirmations and visualizations designed to connect practitioners with their own divine nature and with the ascended masters. Members would gather for decree sessions where they would rhythmically chant affirmations like, "I am the resurrection and the life," or "I am the light of the heart." These weren't considered mere positive thinking, but actual commands to cosmic forces, reshaping reality through the power of the spoken word, combined with visualization and emotion. Ballard's descriptions of the Lemurian facilities inside Mount Shasta became increasingly elaborate as the movement grew. He spoke of vast audiences, halls where thousands of ascended beings would gather for cosmic councils, of laboratories where new technologies were developed that would eventually be released to surface humanity, of healing chambers where any disease could be cured through exposure to certain colours and frequencies of light. He described transportation tubes that connected Mount Shasta with other sacred mountains around the world, creating a network of spiritual centres, maintaining Earth's evolution. The I Am activity reached its peak in the late 1930s, with Ballard filling major auditoriums across America, but after his death in 1939 and subsequent legal challenges to the movement, it fragmented and declined. Yet its influence on American metaphysical culture was profound and lasting. The idea of ascended masters, of Mount Shasta as a spiritual power center, of Lemurian wisdom waiting to be reclaimed, all became permanent features of New Age spirituality. Today, various groups claiming descent from, or inspiration by the original I Am activity, continue to maintain that Mount Shasta houses the preserved wisdom of Lemuria. Pacific Paradise Lost. The Pacific Ocean stretches across more of Earth's surface than all the land combined, a vastness that seems to demand mythology to fill it. As the legend of Lemuria evolved, it increasingly shifted from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, partly because the Pacific's scattered islands and vast empty spaces seemed more accommodating to a lost continent, partly because the Pacific was becoming America's ocean, and Americans were becoming the primary creators and consumers of Lemurian mythology. When you stand on the beaches of Hawaii, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of copper and gold, it's easy to imagine that these islands are the peaks of drowned mountains, that beneath the waves lie the ruins of temples and cities. Hawaiian mythology itself speaks of lost lands, of the homeland called Hawaii, from which the first Polynesians came, of islands that appear and disappear, of a time when the ocean was lower and the islands were larger and more numerous. The Polynesians, those master navigators who found and settled virtually every habitable speck of land in the vast Pacific, carried stories that seemed to echo the Lemurian myth. They spoke of Hiva, a paradisiacal homeland that sank beneath the waves. They told of Mu, which some scholars believe might have been a real place, perhaps one of the island groups that was abandoned during climate changes and sea level rises. These indigenous stories became woven into the Western mythology of Lemuria, lending it an authenticity that pure speculation could never achieve. The Pacific's ring of fire, that circle of volcanoes and earthquake zones that surrounds the ocean, seem to support the idea of massive geological catastrophes capable of sinking continents. Every earthquake, every volcanic eruption, every tsunami became potential evidence that the Pacific was still adjusting to the loss of its continental mass. The deep ocean trenches, like the Mariana Trench plunging 7 miles below sea level, were imagined as scars left by Lemuria's destruction. Chasms opened when the continent broke apart and sank. Easter Island, with its mysterious moai statues staring endlessly out to sea, became perhaps the most important piece of evidence for Pacific Lemuria. Here were monuments that seemed to speak of a lost civilization, faces that might be portraits of the Lemurian race. The fact that the island's inhabitants couldn't explain how the statues were moved, at least not in ways that satisfied Western investigators, only added to the mystery. Surely these were remnants of Lemurian technology, the last visible traces of the drowned continent's greatness. James Churchward's Mu. While theosophists and mystics were elaborating their spiritual visions of Lemuria, a British-American antiquarian named James Churchward was developing his own version of the lost continent story, one he claimed was based on ancient records he had discovered during his time in India. Churchward's lost continent, which he called Mu, would become conflated with Lemuria in popular consciousness, though he insisted they were the same land, known by different names. Churchward's story began, he claimed, in 1868, when he was serving in India as a soldier. He befriended a high priest in a temple monastery who showed him ancient tablets written in a dead language that only 2 other priests in all of India could read. These tablets, which Churchward called the Naical tablets, supposedly contained the history of humanity's true origins on the continent of Mu, which had been located in the Pacific Ocean and was the source of all human civilization. According to Churchward's elaborate chronology, published in a series of books beginning with The Lost Continent of Mu in 1926, Mu had been an enormous landmass stretching from Hawaii to the Marianas, from Easter Island to the Malay Peninsula. It was home to 64 million inhabitants who had developed a sophisticated civilization, while Europe was still covered in ice and humanity elsewhere lived in primitive conditions. The Murians, or Naicals, as Churchward sometimes called them, were described as having developed technology that surpassed our modern achievements. They had aircraft that could travel between continents, ships that could dive beneath the ocean, and weapons that could harness the power of the sun itself. But more importantly, they had achieved a perfect society, without war, without poverty, without disease. They lived in harmony with nature, while also mastering it, understanding the secret forces that governed reality. Churchward filled his books with elaborate maps, symbols, and translations that he claimed came from the Naical tablets and other ancient sources he had discovered in his travels through Asia, Central America, and the Pacific Islands. He showed how Egyptian hieroglyphics, Mayan glyphs, and various Pacific Island scripts were all degraded versions of the original Nayakal writing. He traced architectural similarities between Egyptian pyramids, Mayan temples, and structures throughout Asia and the Pacific, arguing that they all derived from Murian prototypes. The destruction of Mu, according to Churchward, occurred about 12,000 years ago through a combination of volcanic eruptions and earthquakes that literally tore the continent apart. He described in vivid detail how the gas belts beneath the continent exploded, creating massive chambers that caused the land above to collapse into the ocean. The entire catastrophe took only one night, during which 64 million people perished, though some escaped to become the founders of all subsequent civilizations. What made Churchward's work particularly influential was his academic tone and apparent scholarly apparatus. Unlike the mystics and channelers, he presented his ideas as historical research, complete with citations, linguistic analysis, and comparative mythology. He wrote with the confidence of someone who had seen the evidence firsthand, who had held the ancient tablets in his hands, who had walked the ruins of Murian colonies. The fact that no one else ever saw these tablets, that the monastery where they were supposedly kept was never identified, that the high priest who revealed them remained nameless, did little to diminish his credibility among believers. Churchward's influence extended far beyond occult circles. His books inspired numerous expeditions to find evidence of Mu, influenced science fiction writers and filmmakers, and introduced millions to the idea of lost continents in the Pacific. Even today, his maps of Mu are reproduced in books and websites about ancient mysteries. His interpretation of symbols is cited as evidence for prehistoric contact between distant civilizations, and his core claim that civilization is far older than orthodox history, that admits continues to resonate with those who believe that mainstream archaeology has missed or suppressed evidence of humanity's true past. The Nayakal tablets. The story of how James Churchward claimed to have discovered the secret history of Mu deserves examination, for it follows a pattern common to many revelations of lost wisdom. A mysterious teacher, ancient documents that only the initiate can read, and convenient destruction of evidence that prevents verification. Yet the story's very familiarity, its mythic structure, may be part of its enduring appeal. According to Churchward, his education in the mysteries of Mu began when he helped a temple priest recover from a severe famine in India. In gratitude, this priest began teaching him the dead language of the Nayakals, the priestly brotherhood that had preserved the wisdom of Mu through millennia. The learning process was long and difficult, requiring Churchward to master not just a different alphabet, but an entirely different way of understanding symbolic communication, where single characters could contain multiple layers of meaning depending on context and combination. The tablets themselves were described as being made of burned clay, inscribed with symbols that looked like a combination of geometric patterns and stylized pictographs. Some tablets, Churchward claimed, were so old that they crumbled at a touch, requiring extreme care in handling. Others had been preserved through some unknown process that left them as hard as stone. The priest would only allow him to view certain tablets, explaining that others contained knowledge too dangerous to be revealed until humanity had evolved further. The content of the tablets, as Churchward revealed it over his series of books, painted a picture of Mu as the true Garden of Eden, the place where humanity first achieved consciousness and began its long journey toward divinity. The tablets described how humans were created, not through evolution or divine intervention, but through a kind of cosmic necessity, as the universe itself required conscious observers to complete its own evolution. Mu was where this cosmic experiment first succeeded, producing beings capable of understanding their own nature and purpose. According to Churchward's translations, the science of Mu was based on understanding what the tablets called the primary force and the four sacred forces that governed all reality. By manipulating these forces through symbols, sounds, and mental concentration, the Lemurians could accomplish what we would consider miracles, healing any disease, transmuting elements, communicating instantly across any distance, even traveling to other dimensions of reality. This knowledge was encoded in the symbols used in their writing, which were not merely representational but actually functional, capable of channeling cosmic forces when properly activated. The tablets also contained warnings about the misuse of this knowledge. They described previous civilizations on other worlds that had destroyed themselves through the improper application of the primary force. They told of the gradual corruption of Lemurian society as later generations forgot the spiritual principles underlying their technology and began using it for selfish purposes. The destruction of Mu was presented not as a natural disaster, but as a consequence of violating cosmic law, an inevitable result of using sacred knowledge for profane purposes. Edgar Cayce's readings. Edgar Cayce, the Kentucky-born psychic who would become known as the Sleeping Prophet, never set out to reveal the secrets of Lemuria. When he entered his trance, states to give readings, initially focused on medical diagnoses and treatments. He had no conscious interest in lost continents or ancient civilizations. Yet as his readings progressed through the 1920s and 30s, information about Lemuria began emerging spontaneously, usually in the context of explaining present-day problems through past life experiences. Cayce's Lemuria differed in significant ways from the theosophical version. He placed it primarily in the Pacific, existing from approximately 300,000 to 50,000 years ago, with its final destruction occurring long before Atlantis rose to prominence. The Lemurians he described were more recognizably human than Blavatsky's giants. Though they possessed mental and spiritual abilities we have lost, they were presented as peaceful, artistic, and deeply connected to nature, in contrast to the more technologically aggressive Atlanteans who would follow them. According to Cayce's readings, many souls currently incarnated on Earth had previous lives in Lemuria, and their experiences there still influence their current existence. People with strong connections to Lemuria were said to be naturally drawn to healing, to working with crystals and colours, to communication with nature, spirits, and animals. They often felt uncomfortable with modern technology, preferring simple, natural lifestyles. These Lemurian souls were described as being particularly numerous among indigenous peoples of the Pacific and the Americas, though they could be found in all races and nations. Cayce described Lemurian technology as being primarily consciousness-based rather than mechanical. They grew crystals that could store information and energy, but these crystals were living entities rather than mere tools, partnering with humans rather than being used by them. Their architecture was organic, with buildings that were grown rather than constructed, shaped through a combination of guided plant growth and mineral precipitation. They could influence weather patterns through group meditation, heal through the laying on of hands combined with color visualization, and communicate with beings on other planets through what Cayce called thought projection. The spiritual life of Lemuria, in Cayce's vision, centered around what he called the law of one, the understanding that all consciousness is interconnected and that separation is an illusion. Lemurians didn't worship external gods, but recognized the divine within themselves and all life. Their temples were designed as focusing devices for group consciousness, where hundreds or thousands could join their minds to accomplish healing, manifestation, or communication with higher dimensions. These temples were often built around natural power points, hot springs, crystal caves, or areas of unusual magnetic activity. Cayce's most intriguing claims about Lemuria concerned its connections to modern times. He stated that records of Lemurian history and technology were preserved in several locations, in temples beneath the Pacific Ocean that would eventually be rediscovered, in underground chambers in the American Southwest, and in what he called the Hall of Records a chamber beneath the Sphinx in Egypt, where refugees from both Lemuria and Atlantis had stored their combined knowledge. These records, he predicted, would be discovered when humanity was ready to use the information responsibly, which he sometimes placed around the end of the 20th century. Crystal healing and Lemurian seeds. In the late 20th century, a new chapter was added to the Lemurian mythology with the discovery of what became known as Lemurian seed crystals. These clear quartz crystals, distinguished by horizontal striations on one or more faces, were first identified in a Brazilian mine and were claimed to be encoded with information from the Lemurian civilization, placed there before the continent's destruction for future generations to discover. The story goes that Lemurian priests, knowing their civilization was doomed, programmed these crystals with their complete knowledge and scattered them around the globe, particularly in areas that would remain stable through the coming geological changes. These crystals would lie dormant for millennia until humanity reached a level of consciousness capable of accessing their information. The striations on the crystals were said to be like barcodes, containing compressed data that could be downloaded through meditation and proper attunement. Modern crystal healers describe working with Lemurian seed crystals as a profoundly different experience from other stones. They report receiving vivid visions of Lemurian life, downloading healing techniques that seem to come from outside their own knowledge, and experiencing emotional releases connected to what they interpret as past life memories from Lemuria. Some claim that the crystals create connections between people who work with them, forming a network of consciousness that mirrors the telepathic unity of the original Lemurian society. The market for Lemurian seed crystals has grown into a multi-million-dollar industry, with specimens from specific mines commanding high prices based on their supposed connection to different aspects of Lemurian civilization. There are crystals claimed to connect with Lemurian healing temples, others that access their technological knowledge, still others that open communication with Lemurian beings now existing in higher dimensions. Certificate of authenticity accompany many sales, though what exactly is being authenticated remains unclear, since the Lemurian programming is undetectable by any conventional means. The geologists respond. By the early 20th century, as the mythology of Lemuria grew ever more elaborate in occult circles, the scientific community had quietly abandoned the hypothesis that had started it all. The discovery of continental drift by Alfred Wegener in 1912, though not fully accepted until the 1960s, offered a far better explanation for the biogeographical puzzles that had led Philip Sclater to propose Lemuria in the first place. The distribution of lemurs and other species across the southern hemisphere no longer required sunken continents to explain it. Instead, scientists recognized that these lands had once been joined in the supercontinent of Gondwana, which broke apart over millions of years, with the fragments carrying their biological cargo to their current positions. Madagascar and India had indeed been connected, not by a land bridge that sank, but as parts of the same landmass that had slowly drifted apart. The lemurs hadn't crossed an ocean. The ocean had formed between them. Plate tectonics, fully developed by the 1960s, revealed the mechanism by which continents moved. The Earth's crust consisted of massive plates, floating on the semi-liquid mantle below, constantly in motion, creating new seafloor at spreading ridges and destroying old seafloor in subduction zones. This process was slow, measured in centimeters per year, but over geological time, it could move continents across the globe. There was no need for catastrophic sinking of continents. The gradual dance of plate tectonics explained everything. Marine geology definitively disproved the existence of sunken continents in either the Indian or Pacific Oceans. The seafloor in these regions was composed of relatively young basaltic rock, completely different from the older, lighter continental rock. If a continent had sunk, it would have left clear geological evidence: continental crust beneath the ocean, unusual gravity anomalies, specific patterns in seafloor sediments. None of these markers existed. The ocean floor told a clear story of seafloor spreading and subduction, not continental submersion. Modern oceanographic surveys using sophisticated sonar and satellite technology have mapped the ocean floor in unprecedented detail. Every underwater mountain, trench, and plain has been catalogued. If anything, the size of the proposed Lemuria existed beneath the waves, we would have found it. The few underwater features that might once have been above sea level, like the Kerguelen Plateau in the southern Indian Ocean, were too small and too ancient to match any version of the Lemurian hypothesis. Yet science's rejection of Lemuria has done little to diminish its cultural impact. If anything, the geological impossibility of the continent has freed it from the constraints of physical reality, allowing it to exist purely in the realm of imagination and spirituality. Believers simply moved Lemuria to higher dimensions, to parallel realities, to frequencies of existence that conventional science couldn't detect. The continent that began as a scientific hypothesis had completed its transformation into pure myth. Plate tectonics speaks. The Earth's crust tells its own story, written in magnetic stripes on the ocean floor, in the ages of rocks, in the fossil record locked in stone. This story speaks of continents that dance slowly across the globe's surface, joining and separating in cycles lasting hundreds of millions of years. It speaks of oceans that open and close like slowly breathing lungs. It speaks of mountains thrust skyward and ground down to nothing. But nowhere in this vast geological narrative is there room for Lemuria. The Indian Ocean floor is young, mostly less than 180 million years old. The Pacific floor is even younger in many places. Continental crust is fundamentally different from oceanic crust, less dense, unable to sink into the mantle in the way the Lemurian hypothesis requires. When continents collide, they crumple upward into mountain ranges like the Himalayas. When oceanic plates meet continents, it's the ocean floor that dives beneath, not the continent that sinks. The physics simply don't work for disappearing continents. Yet perhaps there's poetry in the truth that science reveals. The real history of Earth's wandering continents is no less wondrous than the myth of Lemuria. India really did travel thousands of miles across an ancient ocean to collide with Asia. Africa and South America really were once joined and carry in their rocks and life the memory of that union. The Earth itself is dynamic, alive, constantly remaking itself. We don't need invented lost continents when the real ones beneath our feet have stories amazing enough. Modern believers. Today, in the 21st century, Lemuria lives on, not as a scientific hypothesis, but as a spiritual homeland for millions around the world. New Age bookstores stock dozens of titles about Lemurian wisdom. YouTube channels with hundreds of thousands of subscribers share guided meditations for connecting with Lemurian consciousness. Workshops and retreats promise to activate your Lemurian DNA or recover your Lemurian past life memories. The myth has evolved far beyond anything Sclater, Blavatsky, or even Churchward could have imagined. Modern Lemurian spirituality tends to emphasize the continent's role as humanity's lost paradise, a time before the fall into separation and conflict. Lemuria represents a state of consciousness as much as a physical place, a way of being that integrated spirit and matter, individual and collective, human and nature. Believers speak of the Lemurian frequency, a vibrational state characterized by unconditional love, telepathic communication, and harmony with all life. The goal isn't to find physical Lemuria, but to recreate Lemurian consciousness in the present. Social media has created global communities of Lemurian believers who share experiences, channel messages, and organize group meditations. They report synchronicities that seem to confirm their connection, finding heart-shaped stones at meaningful moments, seeing repeated number patterns like 1111, meeting strangers who share their Lemurian dreams. These communities provide something that purely rational worldviews often lack: a sense of meaning, belonging, and connection to something greater than individual existence. The environmental movement has embraced aspects of Lemurian mythology, seeing in the story of the continent's destruction a warning about our own relationship with nature. Lemuria fell, according to many modern interpretations, because its inhabitants lost their connection to the earth and began exploiting rather than partnering with natural forces. The story becomes a cautionary tale about technological hubris and the importance of maintaining spiritual balance. Some eco-spiritual groups perform ceremonies to heal the Lemurian wound, the collective trauma they believe humanity carries from the continent's destruction. Indigenous groups, particularly in the Pacific, have complex relationships with Lemurian mythology. Some see it as another form of colonialism, with Westerners inventing ancient civilizations rather than acknowledging the real achievements of Pacific peoples. Others find resonance between Lemurian stories and their own traditions of lost homelands and ancient wisdom. A few have incorporated elements of Lemurian mythology into their own spiritual practices, creating syncretic traditions that blend indigenous and New Age elements. Contemporary physics, particularly quantum mechanics and string theory, has been recruited to support the possibility of Lemuria existing in parallel dimensions or alternative timelines. Believers argue that if reality consists of multiple dimensions beyond the four we normally perceive, Lemuria could exist in these higher dimensions, occasionally intersecting with our reality in ways that create the experiences people report. The continent didn't sink, it shifted to a different frequency of existence where it continues to thrive, accessible to those who can tune their consciousness to the right channel. The power of myth. Why does Lemuria endure? Why do millions of people prefer to believe in a continent that geology says never existed, rather than accept the scientific explanation of lemur distribution, continental drift? The answer lies not in the failure of education or the power of deception, but in the deep human need for meaning, mystery, and connection to something greater than the material world. Lemuria serves psychological and spiritual functions that pure rationalism cannot fulfill. It provides an origin story that makes humanity special, chosen, fallen but redeemable. It offers hope that the wisdom we need to solve our current crises already exists, preserved and waiting to be rediscovered. It creates a sense of community among believers, a shared secret history that binds them together. It gives meaning to personal struggles by framing them as part of a cosmic drama of fall and redemption. The myth also speaks to real losses and real yearnings. Indigenous peoples worldwide have stories of lands lost to rising seas, and archaeology confirms that sea level changes have indeed drowned inhabited areas throughout human history. The universality of flood myths and lost paradise stories suggests they emerge from something deep in human consciousness, whether collective memory, psychological archetype, or spiritual intuition. Lemuria gives these diffuse feelings a name and a narrative. In an age of ecological crisis, Lemuria represents a path not taken, a civilization that might have developed differently, that might have maintained the balance between technological power and spiritual wisdom. It criticizes the present by imagining a past where humans lived in harmony with nature and each other. The impossibility of physically returning to Lemuria becomes irrelevant. What matters is the possibility of creating a Lemurian future, of evolving toward the consciousness the myth represents. The Lemuria myth also demonstrates the power of imagination to create reality, at least psychological and cultural reality. The continent that never existed has influenced real lives, inspired real art, motivated real spiritual practice. People have transformed themselves through their belief in Lemuria, becoming more compassionate, more creative, more connected to nature and each other. In this sense, Lemuria is as real as any idea that changes how people think and live. Perhaps most importantly, Lemuria keeps alive the sense of mystery in a world that can seem increasingly mapped, measured, and explained. It insists that there are still wonders to discover, still secrets hidden in plain sight, still possibilities beyond what consensus reality admits. Even if Lemuria never existed as a physical continent, it exists as a space in human consciousness where magic remains possible, where the ordinary world might suddenly reveal extraordinary depths. Twilight meditations, as the sun sets over the Pacific, painting the ocean in shades of lavender and rose. The boundary between myth and reality grows thin. This is the hour when believers say the veil between dimensions becomes most permeable, when the frequency of Lemuria grows strongest, when sensitive souls might catch glimpses of the continent that exists just beyond ordinary perception. Sit on any beach facing west at this time, they say, and you might feel it, a presence in the waves, a rhythm older than human memory, a calling from beneath the waters. The ocean holds all the memories of Earth, every drop of rain that has ever fallen, every river that has ever flowed, eventually finds its way to the sea. If Lemuria's essence dissolved into the waters when the continent sank, then every wave carries a molecule of that ancient paradise. Every tide brings fragments of lost wisdom to shore. The meditation practices associated with modern Lemuria often begin with water. Practitioners imagine themselves dissolving into the ocean, their consciousness spreading through the global waters, touching every shore, descending to every depth. In this liquid meditation, the boundaries of self disappear. You become the ocean that holds the memory of Lemuria. You become the rain that once fell on Lemurian temples. You become the mist that rose from Lemurian waterfalls. Colors play a crucial role in these twilight meditations. The purple of the evening sky is said to activate the third eye, the organ of spiritual sight that the Lemurians possessed. The gold of the setting sun awakens cellular memories of Lemurian sunlight. The deep blue of the darkening ocean opens channels of communication with Lemurian dolphins and whales, who some believe carry the oral history of the continent in their songs. Practitioners visualize these colors flowing through their bodies, awakening dormant DNA, activating crystalline structures in their cells that resonate with Lemurian frequencies. What Lemuria teaches, whether Lemuria existed as a physical continent or not, its myth carries teachings that resonate with contemporary challenges and yearnings. The story of a civilization that achieved technological prowess but lost its spiritual foundation speaks directly to modern anxieties about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and climate change. We too have gained tremendous power over nature, but struggle to use it wisely. We too risk destroying our world through the misapplication of our discoveries. The Lemurian emphasis on consciousness as primary, with physical reality as secondary, offers an alternative to purely materialist worldviews. It suggests that changing the world begins with changing awareness, that the solutions to external problems lie in internal transformation. This perspective, whether literally true or not, has practical applications in fields from medicine to ecology, where the role of consciousness in shaping outcomes is increasingly recognized. The myth's insistence on ancient wisdom, waiting to be rediscovered, challenges the modern assumption of linear progress. Perhaps we haven't simply evolved from primitive to advanced, but have gained some capacities while losing others. Perhaps indigenous peoples preserve knowledge that technological civilization has forgotten. Perhaps the past has gifts for the future that archaeology alone cannot uncover. The Lemuria myth keeps these possibilities alive in cultural consciousness. The vision of telepathic communication, an empathic connection between all life forms that characterizes Lemurian society, offers a model for moving beyond the isolation, alienation of modern life. Even if we cannot literally read each other's thoughts, we can cultivate deeper empathy, more authentic communication, stronger sense of our interconnection with all life. The myth provides imagery and narrative for experiences and aspirations that conventional language struggles to express. Most fundamentally, Lemuria teaches that human beings need myth, mystery, and meaning as much as we need facts, logic, and proof. The continent that never was has become a container for hopes, dreams, and intuitions that have nowhere else to go in a disenchanted world. It reminds us that not everything valuable can be measured, not everything real can be proven, not everything important can be seen. Dreams of paradise. Every culture dreams of a golden age, a time before time when everything was perfect. For some, it's Eden before the fall. For others, it's the Satya Yuga of Hindu cosmology, or the dream time of Aboriginal Australia. Lemuria has become the modern West's contribution to this ancient tradition, a paradise that's both spiritual and technological, both natural and civilized, both lost and recoverable. The paradise of Lemuria is notably different from religious heavens or mythological Arcadius. It's not a place of eternal rest or simple pastoral life, but a dynamic civilization where beings continue to evolve, create, and explore. Lemurians didn't sit beneath trees eating fruit. They built crystal cities, explored other dimensions, communicated with stellar civilizations, yet they did all this while maintaining harmony with nature and each other. It's a paradise for people who can't quite give up the excitement of progress, but recognize that progress without wisdom leads to catastrophe. This dream of paradise serves important psychological functions. It provides a standard against which to measure the present, always finding it wanting, but also always holding out the possibility of improvement. It offers comfort in times of despair, suggesting that if paradise was possible once, it might be possible again. It creates a sense of shared heritage, making all humans descendants of a common homeland, children of the same lost continent. The ocean remembers nothing. You stand at the edge of the Pacific at dawn, your feet in the foam, where waves exhaust themselves against the shore. The ocean that stretches before you has no memory in any way that science can measure. Every wave is new, even if the water that forms it has circled the globe countless times. The ocean doesn't know that believers say Lemuria lies beneath it. It doesn't remember the continent that never sank because it never existed to sink. Yet standing here, you can understand why the myth persists. The ocean is vast enough to hide anything, deep enough to swallow any story, old enough to have witnessed whatever dreams humans need to project upon it. In the soft light of dawn, with mist rising from the waters, the boundary between possible and impossible seems negotiable. The regular breathing of the waves becomes a rhythm that entrains your consciousness, pulling you into a state where ordinary logic loosens its grip. You close your eyes and imagine, as thousands before you have imagined, that beneath these waters lie crystal temples and golden cities. You picture the Lemurians in their final days, watching the waters rise, knowing their time has ended, but carefully preserving their wisdom for future generations to discover. You see them encoding crystals with their knowledge, sealing chambers that will survive the flooding, sending their children to distant lands with instructions to remember, always to remember. When you open your eyes, the ocean is just the ocean again. No ancient ruins visible beneath the waves, no crystal spires breaking the surface, no ethereal beings materializing from the mist. Yet something has changed, not in the ocean but in you. For a moment, you've touched the part of human consciousness that creates myths, that needs mysteries, that insists on meaning beyond the material. You've participated in the ancient human practice of dreaming worlds into being, of making the invisible real through the power of sustained imagination. The waves continue their eternal conversation with the shore, speaking a language older than words, older than humans, older than any continent that ever existed or was imagined to exist. If they carry any message from Lemuria, it's simply this: that humans will always dream of paradises lost, and paradises possible, will always populate the unknown with wonders, will always seek in the depths of ocean and consciousness for something more than what appears on the surface, echoes in the depths. And so we come to the end of our journey through the myth of Lemuria, a continent that began as a modest scientific hypothesis about lemur distribution and evolved into an elaborate spiritual mythology embraced by millions. From Philip Sclater's careful biogeography to Helena Blavatsky's cosmic visions, from Mount Shasta's hidden cities to the Tamil legends of Kumari Kandam, from Victorian speculation to New Age channeling, Lemuria has proven that some ideas are too powerful to die just because they're scientifically impossible. The story of Lemuria is really the story of human imagination confronting mystery, faced with puzzles we couldn't solve, gaps we couldn't fill, yearnings we couldn't satisfy. We created a continent that could hold all our questions and dreams. That this continent never existed in physical reality matters less than what its myth reveals about human nature. Our need for origins and destinations, our hunger for lost wisdom, our hope that somewhere, somewhen, beings like us, but better achieved what we still struggle toward. Perhaps the true lesson of Lemuria is that humans are myth-making beings as much as rational ones. We don't just need facts, we need stories that make facts meaningful. We don't just need history, we need mystery that makes history magical. We don't just need reality, we need reality enriched by possibility, expanded by imagination, deepened by dream. The continent that never was teaches us about the continents of consciousness we've yet to explore, the dimensions of human experience we've yet to map. In the end, every seeker finds their own Lemuria. For some, it's a literal place waiting to be discovered through archaeology or psychic vision. For others, it's a metaphor for human potential not yet realized. For still others, it's simply a beautiful story that adds wonder to a world that can seem too known, too mapped, too explained. Whatever Lemuria means to each individual, its collective meaning is clear. Humans will always reach beyond the visible toward the invisible, beyond the known toward the mysterious, beyond what is toward what might be. The ocean keeps its secrets, if it has any secrets to keep. The waves that lap against shores around the world carry no messages from sunken continents, no whispers from crystal cities, no memories of giants who walked the earth when the world was young. The Indian and Pacific Oceans are exactly what science says they are. Vast bodies of water, sitting in basins of basaltic rock, moved by currents and tides, home to fish and whales, but not to the ruins of humanity's forgotten homeland. Yet tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll dream of Lemuria anyway. Perhaps you'll walk its crystal cities, speak with its peaceful inhabitants, learn its lost wisdom, and in that dream space, Lemuria will be as real as anything has ever been, because human consciousness makes it so. The continent that exists nowhere exists everywhere, that humans dream of paradise, everywhere that we reach for transcendence, everywhere that we insist there must be more to existence than what meets the eye. May these historical reflections have brought you comfort and calm. May history's gentle embrace guide you to restorative slumber.